Well, good day, Mr. and Mrs. GSA, from border to border and coast to coast and all the ships at sea. Welcome to this GSA Reverse Industry Training numero 3. We are so honored and pleased to have you here today joining us, and not just those of you here in this fabulous auditorium at the headquarters of the U.S. General Services Administration. We are being broadcast worldwide through the greater GSA broadcasting system. Now, usually, too, I'm so very glad that at this point I get to vary my shtick. For the past couple reverse industry training days, we started at 9 o'clock in the morning, so I make some crack about the time zones, and we end up in Port Hawaii. If we started at 9 o'clock in the morning today, it would have been 3 o'clock there. At least by starting at 12 noon, it's 6 o'clock in Hawaii, so it's a little more reasonable that we have actual real-time viewers in Hawaii. Aloha. So thank you for joining us wherever you may be. And now to continue with our program, please allow me to introduce the intrepid producer of these proceedings, GSA's Procurement Ombudsman, Ms. Melissa Gary.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us for round 3. Now, who would have thought last July, when we first rolled out reverse industry training, that within a year we'd be at number 3? But here we are. And I just want to thank everyone who worked behind the scenes to make this a possibility today. My team, including Yvette as resource person, and of course, industry. We could not have done this without you guys. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And everyone else, please enjoy the program today.
Melissa, thank you so very much. Now, we are most pleased to welcome a very special guest to really get things started. This individual began GSA service in July 2017 as the Associate Administrator of GSA's Office of Government-Wide Policy. She did so well there that she was promoted to being the Deputy Administrator. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would, please welcome the Deputy Administrator for the U.S. General Services Administration, the Honorable Allison Brigatti.
Thank you, John. That's a tough act to follow. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. I know we've had 2 very successful reverse industry training days events so far, and I'm pleased to see today's session focus on the public building service. For those of you that don't know, I have a bit of a passion for real estate. I understand that we expect about 500 attendees today, which is a terrific turnout. I'd like to thank our wonderful industry partners for their willingness to put the time and energy into planning today's meeting. As I'm sure many of you are aware, this administration places a great deal of value on our relationship with industry. Both PBS Commissioner Dan Matthews and I think that there are so many great things that can come out of these efforts to increase communication. Special thanks also to Melissa and her team for putting today's event together. I have a very fond place in my heart for the Office of Government-Wide Policy. As you know, Administrator Murphy and I have set priorities around 4 basic tenets: ethical leadership, reducing duplication, generating more competition at the contract and task order level, and increasing agency transparency. Today's event certainly lines up with these goals, especially those around increasing competition and transparency. We hope this will be a great forum where we can continue to learn and understand the parameters and limitations under which we operate as government and industry partners. Awareness and understanding of this dichotomy will result in more effective engagement, stronger partnerships, increased competition, a stronger supplier base, better acquisition outcomes, and greater value to our customers. GSA attendees, you will hear from industry today on what it's like to do business with us, including some of the challenges that they face. Whether you're a contracting officer, a program manager, a core, or a leasing contracting officer, my hope is that these sessions will give you a broader perspective and will help you increase your engagement with our industry partners. Thank you, and enjoy the remainder of the program.
And now we're off. I believe we might all acknowledge that the bulk of innovation in the U.S. comes from industry, whatever it may be. Real property, products, or services, the greatest advances have come in the private sector, and we in the federal government need that creativity. If we want to acquire that kind of innovation and creativity for GSA, we need to welcome, of course, our industry partners. With clarity and consistency, increasing understanding, promoting collaboration, and building trust in our acquisition processes for both our 1170 realty specialists responsible for acquiring and disposing of real property and our 1102 contract specialists who acquire products and services like furniture and design and construction services. So let's listen to our guests discuss their considerations when doing business with the federal government. Now, I say listen, but you are also welcome to interact. In addition to the microphones that we have here for our fabulous studio audience, we would also like you to use your information, and if you're two-fisting it, communication and technology devices. Turn the volume down, yes, but if you see or hear anything that sparks a comment or question in your mind, email it to reverseindustrytraining@gsa.gov. Our moderators will try to weave your questions into their discussions. And for those questions not answered during the live discussions, we'll try to compile a question and answer document and post it along with the recordings of these proceedings. Oh yes, at the end of today's sessions, you should receive by email a survey invitation about this event. Please do respond, as it helps us ensure that we are providing the kind of educational programs that are useful to what it is that you do. Again, now, on with the show. The leasing process, private sector versus government perspectives. I am totally dating myself, but let me ask you all, do you recall that great parody of the 60-minute segment, Point Counterpoint, that Saturday Night Live used to do? The killer line was always when Dan Aykroyd would turn to Jane Curtin and say, "Jane, you ignorant, I can't use the actual quotation," or you might see a reduction in force of 1 later on this afternoon. And I won't identify which character is necessarily government or industry. I'll leave that to your fertile imaginations. But this recollection does lead well into this session and its point counterpoint. So this session will contrast the different views of leasing decisions between government and industry. The federal government is understandably focused on individual agency requirements, yet industry is focusing on project class, cash flow, and residual value. These lead to, I think, somewhat divergent value propositions and impact pricing. So please, let's join our panel as its members discuss challenges with leasing decisions. To lead our panel, please welcome Joseph Brennan, Managing Director at Jones Lang LaSalle.
Good afternoon. We're all very honored to be here and look forward to a productive day. And we're going to focus on a tool that's really critical to us all, the GSA Lease. I'm Joe Brennan. I'm the Managing Director for the Government Investor Services practice at JLL. But before I introduce our distinguished panel, what I want to do is set the table for our discussions today with a few broad questions and ideas. First, the essence of a GSA lease. Sure, in all of our worlds, it's a bargain for important services for a fixed period of time between two very sophisticated parties. But GSA has very precise needs. The private sector has very precise needs. And what we're going to do is we're going to explore them both just a bit in this conversation today. Number two, is there value in achieving a deep understanding of the needs of both of the parties to the lease? Do we really need to understand each other? The answer is yes. and we're going to explore why. We're going to offer some specific examples from the good folks on the panel, and we're going to take it a little bit deeper. As a note, please appreciate that the ownership side of this equation works very hard to understand the needs of your system. Your system, your approach, your pain points. Their goal is to deliver exactly what you need out of a lease transaction and what your customers require. In the spirit of sort of this reverse industry day, we believe it's critical you appreciate what the owners require to best deliver the services you need. 3, where do private sector owners find or lose value in lease negotiations, prospectus development, program of requirements, extensions and change orders? And more importantly, why should you care? Why does it matter to you, and why does it matter to the U.S. taxpayer? Because it has direct impact on the rent. And you need to understand together, we need to understand sort of how we can sort of create deals that are better value for the taxpayer. And then 4, how can we both drive for the highest value for our clients' needs? You've got clients, we've got clients. How can we both do a better job? We're going to endeavor to answer all those questions this afternoon, and we believe events like this are a great start. And thank you for the Ombudsman for putting this together. So let's begin first with you, the GSA. The government's half of the leasing equation, the buyer. A few high-level points relating to the most powerful buyer of real estate in the entire world. GSA houses roughly 500,000 employees in leased space only. The GSA has more than 8,000 leases around the country. Your total annual leasing expense is roughly $5.5 billion, and an annual operating budget, salaries, benefits, roughly $10.5 billion. Your customers need offices, lab space, operations facilities, warehouses in order to run their operations. The government literally couldn't function without what you provide. What you do is a very big deal. Let's briefly look at the other half. The other half of the equation are the investors and the service providers of the private sector. This side of the equation can literally provide the government anything. Any service, any facility, any operation with one basic need. It needs to be financeable. If it's financeable, if it works. If it doesn't, it's very, very complicated. U.S.-based federal real estate leases represent $50 billion in value, a meaningful target for investors. Private sector owners simply need to comfortably predict the returns that they can make for their real estate investments. The classic example, developer delivers a building to the government for a 15-year lease. Seems pretty simple. It's not. Cancellation options, soft term, holdover, vague rent commencement dates, unclear parking income, establishing a tax base, they're all elements that make GSA leases less predictable, less value, and more expensive for the taxpayers. The GSA contract memorializes the bargain between the government and the lessor, and that contract can be priced by the capital markets. The more predictable, the more valuable. Also a direct impact on price. For the investor, the value of the lease contract is directly related to certainty. The certainty in receiving the rent they bargained for over the period of time that they bargained for it. A decrease in certainty is directly related to a decrease in value and results in an increase in cost to the taxpayer. More rent. So a big part of what we're going to discuss today is the impact of certainty for the private sector and for the value it can create for the U.S. taxpayer. We've assembled a very unique panel today. All are federal real estate experts, all have worked inside the federal government, and all currently work for private sector owners who seek to create value by procuring federal leases. Truly a reverse industry day. I'm going to allow them to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into some questions we've developed with our GSA partners. And once we've warmed up the room, we'll open it up to some questions for folks in the room and folks around the country. Leroy, please go first. Thanks.
Good morning. I presume we're on, but it doesn't sound
We're
like?
not, but you have to just be strong.
Okay, got to be strong. Switch on the back.
You want to swap mics?
Testing, testing.
We need some help from the AV squad.
Yeah, this one's it. This is on. Maybe it'll lag today. I'll just begin. Good morning, everyone. Leroy Battle, principal with Urban Development Ventures. Started my career in commercial leasing with GSA in the advanced acquisition program before it was automated, and subsequently left that post and went to work for, at the time, which is one of the region's largest developers. They call themselves Kettler now. It was KSI when I worked there. We basically did large land acquisition projects, and my role was one of land acquisition and to help get us through the zoning entitlement process. And subsequent to that post, I joined a team that managed about 4 million square feet of lease space for the National Institutes of Health. And a couple of gentlemen from that particular team left. We went to Cassidy and Pinkert and started the government service practice with Cassidy and Pinkert. I later started Urban Development Ventures and became a small business partner with the CBRE leasing team servicing the national broker contract. It's a pleasure to be before you this morning.
I'm Joe DeLogu. 30 years ago next month, I accepted my job at the GSA and was a career management intern here for a number of years and eventually a realty specialist and a contracting official. And left, though, to follow my dreams in the private sector. Initially, as I was at a small consulting firm, but met the firm in that capacity that became the spot where I spent the next decade and a half of my life, which was a firm called Spalding & Sly, where I opened the government services division. At Spalding, we grew that division up to 50 people over time. We had the first generation of NBC contracts where we helped GSA out in 33 states doing tenant rep work. While there, I started 3 investment funds with CalSTRS and obviously my other partners, and we bought and operated GSA occupied product around the country. We developed ground up, we did project management and construction work, and property managed about 5 million feet of space that was occupied by the government. I left Spalding & Sly after we sold it to JLL. I stayed at JLL for a few years, but realized my destiny was not to work for a company that was bigger than the town I grew up in. So I started a small business, FD Stonewater, where I'm one of a handful of partners. We have just under 30 people. And one of our centers of expertise is GSA brokerage and ground-up development, which we continue to do today.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for including me in today's presentation. Like my fellow panelists, Joe and Leroy, I too started my career in the federal government. Unlike my 2 fellow panelists, I stuck around. I made a full career of federal government, first with Navy and finished up in National Capital Region, working with some of you side by side who are now sitting in the audience. Once I retired from the federal government, I went to work for a local regional developer, the JBG companies, and then later left and started my own company, where JBG Companies was my largest client. Turn it back to you.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so these are the folks who are going to be able to sort of ask all these great questions of in a few minutes, but I'm going to throw a few soft ones up first and we'll see how we do. Joe DeLogu's going to start, I think, with the first question. Joe, talk a little bit about, please, the impacts of holdovers and short-term leases on how the private sector thinks about those issues. Please.
Sure, happy to do that. Fundamentally, and Joe alluded to this in his opening remarks, one of the most key things that the 2 parties need out of each other, lessor on one side and government on the other, is predictable behavior. And predictable behavior runs through the entire initial development of the space. The government is certainly expecting predictable behavior and performance out of the landlord during the initial stand-up of the facility. Each party is expecting predictable behavior during the term. Landlord is expecting to be paid rent and is expecting operating and tax pass-throughs and economics of the agreement to be lived up to. Likewise, the government is expecting that space to be heated, cooled, operated, cleaned, and taken care of every single day during that lease term. But the critical thing is at the end of that term, the landlord really needs predictable end-of-term behavior out of the government. And the reason that the landlord needs that, I'm going to isolate three key. There are many others, and maybe some of my colleagues can kick some more in after this. But that landlord has promised a lender when the end of the term is. And in all likelihood, loan documents have been set up and agreed to, and there's a term on those documents, and that end-of-term moment is probably linked to the landlord's debt agreements. And tremendous penalties come from not living up to your debt agreements, just like they do for all of us personally. Not living up to your commercial loan agreement is really problematic. In a similar vein, that landlord has investors, and all those investors are expecting to know when the end of the term is succinctly. And it gets to also what happens next, which is what happens next at the end of the term needs to be one of two things. Either the lease needs to be renewed for a proper duration of time so that the landlord has the capability of restructuring his debt and equity arrangements and carrying that lease agreement forward into its next cycle, or that landlord needs to be allowed to market the space to somebody else. What can't happen is neither of those things. That will send the landlord into, fits of anxiety because now we've lost predictable behavior, and we have neither a space that can be marketed and nor financial arrangements with outside debt providers and equity providers that can be lived up to, and that's extremely problematic. And it comes in two forms: holdovers, which Joe alluded to, which, where literally nothing is occurring. We've all just sort of agreed, presumably not to deal with the end-of-term moment for a period of time, or a short-term extension comes up. And I think in our business there's a lot of, I believe, the presumption that when a short-term extension is put in place that, well, we're all good, right? We're really not all good. Because the short-term extension is probably not fulfilling the lender and equity provider's expectation of what economically is supposed to happen at the end of term. It is at best a stopgap, and it is at worst a moment of, sorry. Oh, okay. It's at best a stopgap, and at worst it's a moment of breach of the agreement between the landlord and the landlord's outside debt and equity providers.
And the theme that I want to try to stay with as we go through all of this is, why does this matter to both sides of the equation? You articulated beautifully why that matters to the owner's side, but I want to keep coming back to this with everybody, why this matters, because this bargain that we're putting together is important. So I mean, if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I was going to offer too. I've talked for a fair bit. Do you
Sure.
guys want to throw anything in from your personal experiences on the end-of-term moment as it relates to either holdovers or short-term extensions?
You were fairly comprehensive delivery.
And the only part you
That
left out,
delicate end-of-term moment.
the only part you left out is I usually go in a room and start crying.
All right, we'll keep going. Joe, other sort of half of your question was talking about lease term.
Yeah.
10-year deal versus, talk a little bit more about why a longer-term deal matters to everyone.
So, as many in the room know who've been involved in realty contracting for a long time, this notion of soft term, which is what I think Joe is getting at, has been a very not well understood concept. So let's just start with the high level. Lease term. So if you're us, what you want to be able to bring to the lenders and outside equity providers is the longest firm lease term possible. That's really it. Short of bringing the longest possible lease term possible is you have to have predictable terms, at least. So predictability would look like a contract for 10 years firm and say 2 5-year options. Okay, so we're gonna have predictable decade of income, followed by a fixed moment of whether there'll be a binary yes or no on an option, followed by a second binary moment where there'll be a yes or no on an option. Okay, that's pretty predictable, and it contains little moments of uncertainty where you're going to pass through the gate of the yes or the no on the option. There's been this lease term that's been used, though, inside GSA, which we all call on our side the soft term, which is this instance where the government wants to contract for 10 years, but say only 5 of it will be firm, and the following 5 are going to be what we call soft. And I don't know quite how it's referred to inside, maybe the same term of art, but it basically is a rolling opportunity to exit at any point in time. Now, this goes back to predictable behavior. Now the government has asked for and wants an unpredictable, and on our side, impossible to quantify opportunity to leave in whole or in part, really at any moment in time between the 61st month of the lease and the 120th month of the lease. So, okay, so what goes on in our world when that request comes in? We can't get lenders to underwrite that. They'll underwrite that 5-year term, and they may include a residual value portion, but it's going to be tremendously discounted by the fact that the soft term is essentially an unknown. You have no way to know or promise or literally bank upon the government's continued tenancy. So with that reality, I would say equity providers are the same way, by the way. So everyone in the capital stack is going to look at that as essentially a 5-year commitment. And they're going to force the payback window into a 5-year payback window. So I'm sure everyone in the room understands that. When you take a capital expenditure like the standing up of a new lease and you force it into a 5-year payback window, you force the rent now to balloon up. So in effect, GSA has to pay that rent for that ballooned up privilege of having the ability to exit at any point during the latter 5 years. Conversely, go back to the very first thing I said, what we on our side want is the longest firm lease term possible. So when we capitalize that, so let's take a real long one, right? GSA's maximum leasing authority, 20 years. When we go to capitalize that, we're now going to get lenders and equity providers to all underwrite on a 20-year payback window. And it's the opposite of the 5-year payback window, right? You take that rent, you stretch it out over 20 years to take maximum beneficial use of that payback window. That rent now can slide down. Now, the win-win here is truly a win-win. In that situation, the landlord has predictable term length without the uncertainty of a rolling exit right that could occur at any point in time. And it has a long window. So predictability and long window is the most efficient rent execution we can give you. And of course, all of us want to give you that. No one on our side wants to give you an inefficient rental proposal. We all want to give you the most efficient one possible, and you should want that too. And so on your all side of the table, really pressing your customers on lease term is incredibly important to everyone in this arrangement.
That's great, Joe. Thank you. And you're going to feel this kind of consistent themes as we go through all of these questions. Leroy, if you could, talk a little bit about some examples when, gosh, we get changes in lease terms or requirements during critical moments of these events and what that does to this side of the table's ability to kind of deliver, please.
Certainly. Joe's done a good job of, I think, sharing with us sort of the rational relationship between risk profile and rental rate and lease term and rental rate, so that critical nexus between those. And just to draw from a recent, not so recent deal, but it's not very old actually, was involved in a transaction for a Homeland Security group that had an expiring lease. They were in about a little over 85,000 square feet of flex space in Alexandria, Virginia. And the space was very unique in that it was comprised of about a third office space, about 20,000 square feet of warehouse space, and a little over another 20,000 square feet of special space consisting of a gun range, classrooms, and workout facilities. So very unique space. And the only other comparable facility for this particular group was to travel down to Quantico, to the FBI training facility. And so recognizing that most of the folks were sort of in the metro area, a trip down to Quantico would be sort of a day's exercise, which they could accomplish in Alexandria in half a day, so more efficiency. And so as we entered into conversations about that particular deal, it originally came out as a 10-year lease term with 5 years firm, and the other 5 years soft in Joe's parlance. And so for the landlord, you know, that created somewhat of an issue with them, given the uniqueness of this facility. The offered rate from the government's perspective was not very advantageous. We had them to really to sort of open the Komodo and show the different structure of the rate, office versus warehouse, so we could sort of try to pound the number down to something a bit more reasonable. And of course, from the landlord's perspective, they were saying, well, maybe if you can give me a little bit more term. And during the course of the negotiations, the requirements changed just a bit. You know, the interest of expanding the gun range became one of paramount interest to the end user, so that they can accommodate and have a more robust training facility. And so the conversation ultimately was a matter of, if we're going to invest all this additional dollars in this facility, and given the importance of the facility, does it make sense to just renew the deal for just 5 years? And as a result of that, I think the government made a decision to execute a 10-year lease term, which of course drove down the rental rate. And in addition, there was sort of one other sticking point, the uniqueness of the facility. The government had a requirement to have the landlord to clean the gun range. And I think most of the landlords, particularly in the region that do GSA deals, and even perhaps national, are very much used to the special and unique requirements. You know, everyone sort of waits with bated breath to see what the specials are as a sort of an exercise in trying to knock those down. But in this particular case, cleaning the range became one of additional risk factor that the landlord would like to have had removed. And so ultimately, the end user, who apparently, obviously, being Homeland Security, they're probably a little bit more knowledgeable about gun ranges than Jones Lang LaSalle. And so ultimately, they took that responsibility in-house and removed it from the special requirements. And ultimately, the deal, probably from the initial offer to the deal at the end of the day, probably went down probably almost $7 to $8 per square foot. So it turned out to be very much worthwhile, and certainly in the best interest, I think, of the taxpayer and the government at the end of the day.
Leroy, I'd like to add another case study where in a recent procurement where I was proposing to build a facility for government use. The way we structured our offer created a lot of angst for ourselves. The change that occurred during the procurement was defining what part of the security requirement was in the builder's shell versus in the tenant improvement side. For those of you that may not be familiar with how a rent number comes together, there are certain requirements that the developer, the landlord, lessor is responsible for providing in building a base building, up to a certain condition described as one-lit shell. We are then responsible for offering a tenant improvement allowance to pay for interior build-out. And several years ago, maybe a decade ago, we've added a security allowance for the agency to then customize the building to add in whatever level of security they required. In this particular instance, there were decisions made during the procurement to take some of the security items that otherwise would have been paid for out of the allowance and put it into the building shell, making it the landlord's responsibility. During the procurement, there were many questions asked, many clarifications provided, but at the end of the day, there was doubt in our minds as to, did we cover the security requirement they wanted in the shell adequately enough? Well, the allowance we provided was specified, but it wasn't clear to us totally that we had covered everything in our number. As a consequence, we put a contingency or increased number in there, which translated into a higher rent. And so the motto to this story is keep it simple. When you start doing things that are a little more complicated, it starts creating risk that we see, and we price that risk into the deal. And so to the degree that things are simple, we can give you the best pricing for it.
Yeah, I was going to add, these are great points. In general, we as landlords are, you probably shouldn't ask us to do things that don't really have a normal market context. Like cleaning a gun range is a very unique skill. There's an environmental component to it. We can figure it out, but at the same time, there's probably going to be a contingency associated with that. So as you put an RLP together, reflect upon, am I asking for things that are kind of market normal? And if it's not market normal, is it a good idea to ask the landlord to do a market normal or market not normal thing? And it's really possible that there's no one else out there in a market that can provide it. And maybe the answer to that's yes. Maybe you should ask the landlord. But maybe the answer to that's no. And that's a possibility too. But just in these generalisms, we're definitely, we can't tell the future any better than you can. You probably only want to ask us to do market normal things. And we're way better at certainty than we are at uncertainty, like John's example on scope of work.
Absolutely. One of the things that the Ombudsman had suggested that we try to walk away from as we go through these are aha moments. We hate short-term deals. We hate soft-term. So should you. And this it costs you more. You're paying for, you're getting flexibility that frankly, and very often that you don't need, and you're paying for it. The taxpayers are paying for it. Back to the gun range, which is a really interesting example. We're great at paying for it. We could figure out how to pay for that function and go out and hire that person. We just figured into the deal. But again, on short-term leases, on other things, we can't do that. But if we know ahead of time and we know that that's a function that you need, those are the kinds of things we can do. Again, back to that, we can do almost anything if it's financeable. John, a couple of things we had talked about earlier. schedules, delay impacts, and some other things that kind of go into how we sort of, what impacts our leases and the certainty that goes into them. And then I think you may also want to talk a little bit about sort of the wonderful things and the things that aren't so wonderful about a full-service lease structure, please.
Delay. You guys hate delay. You have delay clauses in your leases. Factor that by times 10, that's how much we hate delay. Every decision, if I back up a minute, when the private sector makes a decision to propose on a lease procurement, we're underwriting a building and the costs engendered in bringing that building forward. And we're spending a lot of time analyzing what it will cost us, how we're going to finance it, how much equity are we putting out, and what are the returns. We do what we refer to as a pro forma analysis that looks at the revenues minus expenses, calculating net operating income, and looking at the debt capacity on a particular project. All that's done over a time period. Anytime that time period changes, and usually it's not shorter, it's longer, it wreaks havoc on our estimates and changes the profitability of the deal. And so when we enter into setting rate structures, it's all based on assumptions we make on financing, and there's a lot of risk on interest rate. Delay only causes problems when we start paying debt service and how much capitalized interest is then put into the project. And so delays for us really erodes the profitability of buildings, and it makes it difficult for some companies to actually go after GSA leases if they fear there will be delay in the process getting to the end result. And we don't look at delay as, at least I've never looked at delay as government delay versus private sector delay. Delay is delay. Delay changes the nature of the deal. And one of the things I've always worked hard on the deals I've touched is to make sure they're delivered on schedule so everybody's happy. I've talked about the pro forma and how we look at revenue and expenses. So let me dwell a little bit on the expense side. Typical rents are made up of three kinds of expenses as we look at them. Taxes, utility, and operating expenses. Those are very important aspects of the expense profile of any project because what's left over is defined as net operating income. And that's what we in the financial industry uses to size debt on a project. So how we judge and estimate future expenses are very important in our process. So let me talk about utilities, because that's one of my buttons, if you will. Utilities in a full-service lease are paid for under the lease rental rate. However, when we're setting up that rental rate, we really don't know what the actual consumption of the user will be. All we can go by is historical data or average usage in an environment or geographic location. And so there is some risk as to consumption. And that's a risk that we cover by putting a buffer in. In other words, we charge you a little more every month because we don't know exactly what you're going to use. And so on the deals that I've done in this region, the last three large deals, and they were all single-tenant deals, my first amendment is to go net utilities. It allows the government to then pay direct. A little side note to that is you have a bulk utility rate that is far less than anything I would pay. So it is a true win-win, because I'd rather not cover that contingency, and you get to pay much less. Taxes is another one. The tax clause has changed through the years. Every improvement makes it more complex and a little bit more difficult to administer. And setting the right tax base in your rent is a true guessing game for us. So again, setting a tax base during a procurement, we're going to guess a little on the high side because you don't want a tax base in the lease that is underestimating what we are responsible to pay during the term of the lease. So these are two aspects of the rental rate that we include in a full-service rent that actually, if you could figure out a more streamlined way of setting the tax base or paying for taxes directly and paying utilities directly, you would get a savings.
Before we go into the color aspect of this, two things. One, for our listeners and viewers around the country, we're going to go to you all for some questions when this is done, so please send them in. I've got an iPad here ready to respond. I think the website has been passed out to everybody, so please shoot us a question, and as soon as we're finished with this, we'll be ready to talk about it. And
Joe, you should invite the audience, for those who haven't fallen asleep, to ask questions as well.
Absolutely as well. And we're also saying we're glad Commissioner Matthews is here, so we're holding our crowd together too, which is good. And the other thing is we're hearing from the broadcast, apparently my voice is okay. If you guys could speak up a little bit more as we go through this, that would be great. All right, so John, on schedule impact and full service lease, do you guys have any other thoughts on the advances and pitfalls associated with both of those?
Yeah, I'll layer on top
Please do.
of John's response. The schedule management aspect of, for instance, with our build-to-suit lease program, everyone who works at our company is schooled that the schedule is the schedule, and first tier is delay, and we just need to fix it. Because it really doesn't benefit anybody to quibble over how we got to a delay situation. That's kind of lose-lose, and we understand that it's some extenuating situation. We have to go there, but the first tier that our team is trying to do is to work out, let's just fix it, and let's try to save some time elsewhere in the schedule so we can get back consistent with the delivery promise that we've made to everybody. Yeah, because I can't say enough, John's comment about how corrosive delay is to a deal's economics cannot be understated. It's Armageddon at some level, where extensive delays can ruin deals. And not just ruin the setup of deals, they ruin the entire term of the deal, because the delay and the economic impact of it has obliterated all the upside to the owner by virtue of that loss and delay.
Go deeper in that. Interest rates and bid prices move. And
sure. If you can't deliver the building when promised to the lender and the equity providers, at best you have a loan workout on your hands and equity workout. At worst, you're in default, and you are now in a serious predicament with lenders. Now, no lender really wants to get the building back. But that workout can be extremely costly, and the workout, in effect, can suck all the upside out of the deal.
Well, Joe, simply put, when you structure a deal, debt service starts on a date certain.
Absolutely.
Not on when the rental rate goes into effect, not on lease commencement. So if a deal lags by any period of time, you have to start performing on the debt service before you have any revenue.
got to pay the band. And the building's not delivered, and that's a problem, and the rent's not in, and it's rent start date. It's all of those kinds of things that go in. And so back to this sort of symbiotic relationship, we can deliver anything. But
So,
we've got to be
Joe,
able to-
that might be, I mean, if I were to leave people with kind of like,
Sure.
okay, so what could we all do with that? Maybe I would suggest my first response, the way I opened up, would be, this is what you can do, which is the first tier management of delays is to not get into finger pointing initially. Let's get into fixing it, because fixing it's actually good for everybody, and then we don't have to get to finger pointing. So fixing it may mean accelerating a design review. It may mean accelerating things that your client is doing on the process. But the first tier addressing of a delay should be, let's just all fix it. And it's not really good for anyone if folks in the process stand back and kind of wait for the other guy to fix it, or the other guy to just sort of soak it up. It's everybody's problem initially before we get to kind of whose problem it is, and it's better just to fix it.
I just wanted to, John, you mentioned something that sort of struck a chord with me. You mentioned that we're aware that there've been several, not a ton, but several tweaks, changes to the GSA tax language over the years, and there was maybe 15 years ago, language added where if the landlord went and got a tax appeal, that the GSA could sort of participate or be knowledgeable sort of in that process. And you mentioned, establishing the tax base becomes somewhat of a guessing game, but a bit downstream, as the landlords maybe go forward with an appeal, have there been opportunities in your experience where there may be something lease workouts done that might make adjustments to the base, or is it just hasn't been impactful at all?
Well, first of all, am I allowed to take questions from the other panelists?
Absolutely.
We appeal many of our leases almost on a regular basis. However, in my mind, there's a distinction between an appeal amount and the base. The appeals don't impact the base. All they do is return money to the government. Because if we get a downward adjustment, that basically goes back to the government minus the cost of pursuing the appeal.
That's why I sort of posed that question, just so that there was no net benefit for the landlord based upon the new operating language in those documents.
No, the documents in my mind are pretty clear that the responsibility rests on the landlord to basically appeal unfair taxes on behalf of the government. When we send in a bill, we're the first scrubber. If we think the tax bill is too high, we go after the jurisdiction and get right the correct tax.
Hey, I was going to carry this maybe in a slightly different direction, but hopefully it's healthy. The tax clause is a really good example of one of many numerous ways in which GSA puts forth kind of one-size-fits-all criteria. And sometimes that's okay, because sometimes one size actually does come pretty close to fitting all. But the tax clause is definitely not one of them. And a good example of maybe taking two sides. In instance number one, you're going to go in a multi-tenanted office building and you're competing lease requirement maybe in an urban area. And maybe it is healthy just to allow the taxes to be wrapped right in there and to be part of the full service evaluation so that you can be measuring the differences in taxation levels between the different buildings you might be looking at and embed it right into the financial analysis. I can see how that works. On the other side, though, might be your build-a-suit program, where you're gonna do a build-a-suit in a market for the XYZ agency, and everyone building is proposing to bid you a brand new build-a-suit. Well, then you're just making all those guys guess. And back to my remark where we don't really tell the future any better than you guys do. But if you make us tell the future, we're all going to put a contingency on it because we don't want to be wrong. It actually might be more financially efficient just to go net of electricity, like John says in that case, because we can't tell the future on the power bill any better than you can either. And it might be more efficient to just pay the actual expense when those bills come in by going net, or to agree upon a base, like with taxes in the build-a-suit program. Because in that program, there's really no demonstrable benefit to you by going full serve. Odds are we're all looking at the same mill rate from the locality. We're all going to calculate the thing the same way. So the benefit is elusive. So two examples. One, there's a benefit. The other, clearly no benefit.
Well, and
Caution,
go ahead.
caution on the net utilities are really net electric. That's certainly not one size fits all. When you're in a multi-tenanted building, it's very difficult to go net electric. If you're in a single user building, it is the way to go. And for me, the tripping wire is, can I get a meter direct from the utility company and put that meter in the government's name so they can take advantage of their bulk buy program and get a reduced rate? If you can do that, I would be advocating for you to do that because it saves you money.
Well, this is at the risk of being sort of, the least boring, I mean, the least exciting folks at the lunch hour to go deep on taxes, for God's sakes. But that's a challenge. I guess to summarize just a bit, the tax piece, the operating piece, is a huge risk for developers. The government's intent is to pay the taxes. The government's intent is to pay the pass-throughs on the electric. It's costing you more. It's costing the government more because we're trying to cover it on the back end.
Hey, Joe, context for everyone in the room. The way that you all handle operating expenses, I'm sure everyone knows this, but I'm just going to say it, it's really non-market, right? Because the market out there is calculating what's called an expense stop. And I won't take the time to sort of explain how an expense stop works. But when you do it the way that it's done in the GSA lease, if someone's wrong, pardon me, if one of us landlords are wrong on our calculation of what we project the base to be, we're wrong for the entire lease term.
We've guessed wrong.
Yeah, right. Whereas in an expense stop situation, if a landlord is wrong in year one, well, the expense stop will just fix itself the following year. Yeah, because you're going to go over to paying based on actuals. And so in instances where you don't want us really forecasting the future, kind of better not to ask us to.
All right, we've gotten our first question from around the country, from Ms. Hernandez. And this is a good one, actually. Think about build-to-suits. Do we think about build-to-suits differently than we sort of a normal lease, a normal multi-tenant lease? And how do we think differently? How do we approach a build-to-suit differently than we would sort of a regular lease?
I'll go ahead and
Go
jump
ahead,
in.
sure.
We have a big business of brokering deals inside multi-tenant office buildings as well as a build-to-suit program. So I've got a lot of thinking on these two things. The build-to-suit program, the biggest difference is we're custom crafting every aspect of that execution to meet the government's needs. Every aspect. So it's completely financially engineered to be responsive to your RLP. It's completely built in a totally customized fashion. There's a direct one-to-one relationship between any change in your ask and our response. In an existing office building, your needs are being diluted over this bigger base of everything else that is going on in that building. And that might affect kind of how operating expenses are, well, it affects really how everything is looked at. The building isn't being capitalized, customized with your need. It was capitalized already when you showed up. There was already a loan in place, an owner in place, investors in place, and you're just kind of tucking in there. Yeah, so those are probably the biggest differences.
If I could add on, I think also the leasing in a multi-tenant situation is more market-based, because it's really what is the competition for that space.
That's a great point.
It's not based on the cost of the space, it's based on what will Leroy pay versus Joe.
Yeah, alternatives.
Yeah. Whereas the build-to-suits, which is what I've focused on, is we spend every dollar of the rent. I mean, the rent is engineered based on the demands of the user, and we design a building for the user.
Mm-hmm.
So we could also take Leroy's firing range. It comes up again and again, right? But asking for kind of dramatically non-market things inside of a multi-tenanted office building, you've got to appreciate is a fairly provocative thing. So you aren't going to bring the firing range into the building on Fifth Avenue, probably. And there are lots of examples like that kind of crop up, where we get these sort of kind of dramatic non-market asks inside of regular office buildings. And, some are really dramatic and some are kind of closer to the edge. Bringing prisoners into the market office building, probably not a good idea. But there's certainly plenty of landlords who understand that the government's money is green and that it's a really great deal, and they're willing to do those deals if it kind of works out inside the building.
And I'd also, again, back to the kind of symbiotic piece, why do we, why should you all care that matters to this side of the table? It impacts the deal. it could impact our insurance, for example. I mean, whether you're bringing prisoners in or you've got a firing range or, you know, I was involved in one where it was a sort of a very critical facility and they were, you know, worried if somebody from the cleaning staff damaged a computer and it had impact on sort of, you know, satellites and airplanes in the sky. I mean, what does that have to do with anything? Well, those were discussions, and so there was a big insurance discussion there. Firing range, for God's sake, the last place when we
Joe,
get to...
there's an assignment risk in there too.
Sure.
So after the initial deal setup, you know, folks need to appreciate that we're concerned about the fact that you have assignment and subletting rights inside your standard lease. And so if we believe we've contracted for the Department of Justice and they're going to be coming with a bunch of, you know, clean-cut lawyers and everything's going to look real executive, and then all of a sudden that group leaves and the next group in is going to be, you know, a function that has a high visitor component or introduces weapons into the building or has, you know, just a completely different use. If we come to you and we're wanting to sort of talk about the assignment and subletting clause, it's because we're afraid of that stuff, because that stuff actually happens.
Exactly right. And it's also another risk is involving other government agencies. We have a firing range, all of a sudden here comes the EPA, and we've got to deal with our building. How do we think about that, and what's happening with lead and arsenic, asbestos, all those kinds of things that happen. I mean, those are all elements that we're pricing into some of these deals. Anyway, just wearing the other guy's sort of shoes for a moment, those are the things that we think about as we get into these. Oh, this is an interesting one. Okay, so this is from, I think, Ms. Hernandez again. How significant are rental escalations? What does that do to our value creation, and how does the sort of GSA's sort of practice of having flat rents, and how does that sort of work as the private sector likes escalating rents? Go ahead, guys.
Flat rents are non-market. I mean, we can just start there. In the vast lion's share of the markets out there in the United States, an escalating rent is market normal. So right at the gateway, you're asking the landlord to agree to something that's just a little different than what they've usually done. Usually not a problem. It's just a different financial engineering exercise to go ahead and take the rent and flatten it out.
Let me just ask one second. I think there's a microphone somewhere. We would love to make sure that you make the broadcast.
If not, Joe, why don't you just repeat the question?
Thank you very much. There we go.
That's all right, just talk about it.
Along those lines, so often we get offers in with free rent at the beginning. So whether there's a rent step or free rent, if it's a firm term of, say, 10 years, what difference does it make if you just, you know, if you're careful with how you flatten it out, it all is the same money at the end? So why is it that we're receiving so much free rent at the beginning and then as opposed to flat when we know that might be what we like?
But the free rent is even a whole different animal, and that's a great question. I mean, I think we can talk a lot about both.
So I was going to go back and remark that in the escalating rent situation, if it's a build-to-suit, it probably doesn't matter, because you're going to custom engineer the capitalization of that building, and it can be flat if that's what you want it to be. If you're going into a multi-tenant building, odds are that owner has pro forma those rents to be going up, and he's not living up to the pro forma. Those pro formas are promulgated to his lenders and outside investors and everybody else. And so you're definitely presenting a landlord with a bit of a square peg round hole situation in that case. He'll probably figure it out, but it's going to be a little uncomfortable.
Also, in escalating rents, which are commercial market, it provides you ways to fix mistakes because there's more income over time. So if your operating expenses are going up faster than you had predicted and you're in a full-service lease, you have some additional cash flow to deal with that. But you asked a specific question just a moment ago, and I'm not sure Joe answered it.
So it was
I was
more
going to come
along
back to
the
that. Go ahead.
the free rent?
Yeah.
The free rent.
So, I mean, why, I'm just curious, since, for instance, somewhere back in the discussion, you had pointed out that if there's a delay, and let's say occasionally there are delays, and then you're hit with a free rent period as well, then,
There we go.
I mean, I can't figure out why you would do that.
So
'Cause
why
then
do
you're
we
not
do
coming-
free rent?
Yeah, as opposed to just making it a flat rent
Well, I can
over the
answer-
10-year period.
I can answer for
Great
myself.
question.
We score better in your evaluation of net present value.
But can't you adjust it such that, you could adjust it such
maintain
that
a
that
coupon
wouldn't be
too,
in
isn't it?
place?
You do a discounting over net present value, and you don't discount year one. And so providing you free rent gets maximum return in your evaluation model.
I understand that, but I mean, you could adjust the rents to make up for that. So I was just curious for you, who say you'd like to get rents,
We-
because you're afraid that with the delay, then you're not getting income in, then that's another, 2 years or year, however many months you have worth. I mean, I'm just curious, it doesn't really
So
matter because we do the
There-
MPV.
There's one
way.
more point that I think.
I have a slightly different answer, which is we're living at the moment in a bit of a market where free rent is good, and I'm going to explain why. At the moment, and I'm going to use the build-to-suit as an example, it is cost efficient for us to capitalize the temporary loss of income associated with free rent in exchange for a higher coupon after that free rent period is burned off. Because at the moment, cap rates are the rates upon sale. Okay. At the moment, cap rates are favorable, and we will come out better than a flat rent execution. So with the capital markets being what they are today, our firm would generally do a free rent deal or a deal where there's a large cash concession up front because we want that higher coupon for the rent paying period, and it is likely driven by an intent to sell because the sale price will be calculated on that coupon upon exit.
And panelists, just remember to speak up if you can, please. I'm getting
This last
hostile
question?
from the back. No, they would like for you all to be stronger, with
Louder.
your voices louder, yes. Taller.
I want to follow up on the free rent question just very quickly. John already mentioned that I think the GSA scoring or analysis model, and it's something that the market sort of understands. And given, I think if we go back maybe to even the mid-2000s, there's been very much precedent set for if you do a year's free or 3 years free. I've seen those deals that sort of put you in the renter circle. And then in this climate where, sometimes we've termed the large deals sort of like elephants, the 500,000 square foot deals. The elephants, they don't run very often, but when you see one running, you should best position yourself to be successful. And so in those scenarios, I think most of the marketplace is very much keen to offering as much free rent as possible, given the competitive set, those competitors' buildings that they may be competing against. And also, there was a window, I think 2007 going forward will probably be okay, but if we turn the clock back just a few years prior to that, where they may have been a bit more of a cessation in deals being transactions, many landlords were sort of throwing out their pro forma, because if you got a new building, it's sitting vacant, you tell the broker, this is the number I want, and the guy next to you who just recently delivered, he's kind of gotten deals that you may have been waiting for, and so there may be instances where you just have to sort of throw the pro forma out, and as Joe stated, you get your return on the back end. You're basically setting yourself up for sale to some institutional player that's more interested in sort of a long-term return on investment.
All right, I'm going to,
Joe, I think you have one.
One more. from
oh,
John.
excuse me.
I just wanted to piggyback a little bit on Elaine's comment. We were actually discussing an actual offer this morning where we had a significant amount of free rent. Let's call it 2 years for the sake of discussion. And when you do the present value, you're essentially, we have another issue we have two issues with it from the government side. the actual net present value was, let's say, 20% below the program rate that was allowable in that jurisdiction, which is a problem. That part isn't a problem. But when the rent actually kicks in 2 years later, it's 25% higher than our program rate, which does create a large headache for us. It also creates a large headache for the agencies because we pass through the rent in a sublease kind of arrangement, operating agreement we call them. And so the agency itself would, let's say, we would pass through that rent for no rent for 2 years. That affects their budgeting capability. And, it's a problem for a government tenant to say, I've got no rent for 2 years, and all of a sudden now I've got, a huge spike in rent in year 3. So I think there needs to be, I was wondering this morning if there needs to be something in our RLP that states if it's that kind of free rent, it needs to be somehow leveled. Because I don't think it really works for our ultimate client.
So there are,
Or the lessor for that. I mean, I understand how you would capitalize it and it creates more value ultimately that you can capitalize. But it's sort of a disconnect, I think, in this kind of market situation where there's, it's a tenant market, I think, in a lot of jurisdictions.
Sure, and I'm going to, just a little piece of this, and I'm sure we'll all dive into this a lot. This is, I think, one of those instances where it's worth a conversation, and I appreciate sort of your mission is to get those folks in space, meet the precise things that they need when they pay their rent. The other side of the table is trying to deliver the facility that you've asked for within the guidelines. And one of the challenges is changing the rules in the middle of the game. Really is a devastating problem for this side of the table. Now, can we do it? Sure. But the thing I guess that I would consider there is the ability on sort of the financial markets to look at the deal in one way, and the other is simple policy. I mean, but maybe policy is never simple, so we understand that too. So go ahead.
So a comment back, and this is, if I'm allowed to ask a question of the audience, to that point. Is there any prohibition between your agreement with the tenant through your occupancy agreement versus your agreement with the landlord in your lease, such that you could charge the tenant the levelized version? So they, from a budgeting standpoint, they pay you the lower fee, if you will, the lower rent, but then the federal building fund washes it through and pays the landlord the rent that was in the lease. You could do it such that you're budget neutral, not on a year-to-year, but over the term of the lease, and use the federal building fund to create a steady budget for the agency, which is, I think, your point.
I mean, I think that's a great idea. It's way above my pay grade, but it's something that I think we ought to consider, because I think ultimately we're trying to deliver space for that client agency, and they don't have that budgeting flexibility with, because it's annual appropriations, and we've seen what we went through just recently.
And that is, as Joe pointed out, a clash between a agency budgeting issue and a procurement practice.
I was going to add to John's point that there are private corporations who do exactly what he is advocating, where back in the day, for my Spalding / JLL days, there was a large corporate services business, and I was very aware, because a friend of mine ran one of the accounts, that they would take concessions and effectively levelize them out. And the users, it's a large military contractor, so often under one roof there would be numerous kind of customers, if you will. They would pay the levelized number so that the real estate branch of the organization, they were getting that concession and effectively washing it through the economics of the deal. The thing you wouldn't want to miss out on is if a landlord has this tool that they can offer you as a concession, it's a great tool, you should take it. And as frequently in multi-tenanted office buildings, you know, that landlord's got in that pro forma setup costs. They're part of the pro forma budget, and oftentimes the setup cost not used can be given as cash, and free rent that's been factored into an owner's pro forma is there for you to take. That's what it's intended for in their pro forma. And so you wouldn't want to turn your back on a great, you know, benefit just because of you know, hopefully a solvable budget, you know, matter.
Anybody else? All right, we've got one more over the internet we can sort of look to. This is from John, and it sounds like there's some contact being made. From a lending and leasing and financing perspective, what's the best, most viable, ideal lease term? Is that 10?
What's the best what?
What's the best firm term? And the question is, and two parts, is what is it, and is there a difference between a private sector user and a federal user between that lease term? Would you look at it differently?
Really great question. You want to lead, or?
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, okay. It's all case dependent, but here's what's going on for us. So if you come at us and you've got let's say you build a suit because it's easy, and you're custom crafting the capitalization. If you come and you're asking for a 10-year term, there's a community of 10-year lenders and 10-year kind of equity sources out there, and it's kind of one answer. Anything less than 10 on a build-to-suit would be borderline not financeable, so why don't we not deal with that just for a second? But there's kind of community A for shorter firm-term deals, and then there's actually community B for long-term, and this would be kind of anchored by the syndicated bond financing crowd, of which there are numerous providers who will effectively take your, let's use a 20-year just as for example. You have 240 promised rent payments at a specific period of time, and these syndicated bond financiers will sell every single one of those rent payment strips to investors, sometimes in bulk, sometimes in segments. But you can go to the syndicated bond finance crowd for the longer term leases, and it's a different capitalization. Now, is one better than another? That a little bit deals with what are the government's needs. If they truly only have a 10-year need, then I guess they should really only go and contract for 10 years. If they really actually do have a 15 or a 20-year need, well, they should go get the longest term possible, because some of our lending communities' toolkit is way more efficient for those long terms. And that efficiency can translate into lower rent, which goes right back to the government.
So my answer is a little different, though analogous. You have 20-year statutory authority, so I'm not going to recommend going more than 20 years, because you can't. If you have need for 15, you start at 15. So the question really becomes, between 15 and 20, is there an ideal term? And the answer truly is, longer is better. However, under the current scoring rules, you have to ensure you're an operating lease. Most of the math that I've done makes it very difficult, in my eyes, to get an operating lease determination once you get past 18 years. Nothing magic about that number. It could be 17, it could be 19, you could even do a 20. For the most part, once you start getting 17, 18 years, you're nearing the 90% of net present value calculation that trips you into a capital lease. So for the most part, doing 15-year terms, they're financeable and they're operating leases. Now, my answer is only good for today. As scoring rules will change in the next couple of years, is my prediction, you'll get a different answer, because the future, I believe, holds a change in scoring such that there will be no more operating leases. Everything will be considered a capital lease. It's being done on the private side. The government financial board is looking to do the same for the government side. And then all of this will go out the window. You'll put everything on your books. And quite frankly, at that point, you'll be doing 30-year deals.
Yeah, John's comment that all capital markets answers are good for the duration of this presentation
Right.
only, that's really
True.
real. I mean, the capital markets change, and therefore the answer sometimes changes.
Absolutely. Lori, you good with all this?
Yep.
Okay. Great. And I also want to keep bringing this back to sort of our own context. What we're talking about in a lot of these is market. Market gets made at 10-year deals, a market gets made in the credit tenant lease market, a market gets made, and when it fits in that sort of box that's our market, it makes it sort of more simple and easy to do. We can do it, but you know, these deals are hard enough. I would almost put it back to you all in the same thing. If we come to you and say, my gosh, there's a fire life safety issue, your response is, that's a problem for us. That's your market. You know, sometimes we can revert to local code. Sometimes we can figure out ways to fix it. But again, these things are hard enough. So when we're living in our market box and you all are living in your market box, these are the kinds of things that we need to try to really work together on. We have about 3 minutes. Gentlemen, do you all have any other sort of thoughts before I wrap this up? No.
I would just say that I think over the years, you know, I've certainly seen, from my vantage point in GSA, as a leader in this space, not just here, but certainly nationally, and provided that, you know, there's continued sort of open conversation. The small deal that I mentioned as an example, I think we had some very open-minded people. The user sort of had access to dollars. They could make decisions in terms of the lease term very quickly, and the CO was quite flexible and a good listener and a good executioner. And so, you know, and those are, I think, the good sort of building blocks to have good transactions.
Excellent.
Actually, there is one thing I'd like to say. Yeah, surprised everybody.
Now I'm going to feel obliged.
Having been on both sides of the transaction, my hat's off to you. What you do is so much harder than what I do now on the private side. Your job in dealing with all of the rules and dealing with your client base and trying to be good stewards for the federal government is one of the most difficult jobs in the government. So congratulations on a job well done, and my hat's off to you.
In conclusion, I just want to thank you all for allowing us to come to a Reverse Industry Day. Kind of a big deal. I think this is great for us to be able to share with you all how we look at the world, and we really work hard to try to understand how you all look at the world, and this is very, very, very valuable. Thank you to the Office of the Ombudsman for putting this whole thing together and allowing us to come sit with you on this beautiful facility, and thanks everybody from around the country who's listening out there. The real sort of key is, and I think we've tried to be precise, is if we can predict it, we can price it, and if we can price it, we can pass it along to you. If we can't predict it and we're guessing, we're bad, just like you guys were bad, you know, when you guess, you're bad. So that's our half of the equation, and we hope to make it fit into your half of the equation as we press on with these critical deals for the federal government and the taxpayer. Thank you very much.